Hello! This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby! And I am your myth-obsessed nerd host who is sort of out of place right now in this distinctly historic series of episodes. And, of course, I've managed to make it as mythological as possible, all the same. But as we get further and further into this collapse of the Bronze Age and all of its many causes, all the little things that went into this collapse of the elite power structures. Oh, it's utterly fascinating. Oh my God. So today's episode is with another returning guest, Dr. Flint Dibble, who talked to me about Atlantis last year? The year before? What is time? And Flint came back to talk about this Bronze Age collapse and how it relates to what he studies, which is like animal bones and like eating via, like, it's fascinating. Fascinating stuff. It's a type of archaeology that I just didn't even think about until I learned, like, of course it's a thing. And we can learn so much from animal bones in terms of like how they sacrificed the animals, how they ate them, what they prioritized, like all of these different things, and also the climate as it aligns with food. Completely fascinating. We have such a great conversation coming, and I just have to say the biggest joy that has come out of this Bronze Age collapse episodes, like the whole series, is my realization that I knew about the collapse for sure. I did not know how much climate change came into play with it, and how much these experts on this stuff are just so aware of the modern ramifications. Like I didn't expect it to be like a very, very forceful wake-up call in terms of climate change. So stay tuned for that. And without any further ado from me, let's listen to how food can tell us so much about the collapse of the Bronze Age. Conversations. The evidence is in the thigh bone. Climate and collapse in the Bronze Age with Dr. Flint Dibble. So, I mean, I'm very excited for this. Climate change is like my obsession in the modern world. So I like to hear about, like, you know, I mean, I know it's obviously a very different climate change, but the Bronze Age and the foodways and all of the different things that, you know, affected that whole time period is utterly fascinating. So do you want to just give me like a kind of overview of what that means? Like, just foodways broadly, or what you study regarding this?
Yeah, so I specifically study ancient animal remains.
Mm-hmm.
So I look at sort of the bones and the teeth from sheep and goats mostly, but also some cattle, pigs, dogs, you know, the whole range, horses, donkeys, that kind
so
of...
wild to me. So specific.
I don't actually study too many wild animals, a few, but I focus on larger mammals. And
Yeah.
I work with people that focus on fish and birds and really tiny mammals. Though I will study deer, and hair. I'm really interested in hair. But that doesn't have anything to do with the Bronze Age. But so I study ancient animals, and what that lets you put together, and in particular, since I look at mostly domesticated animals, is kind of the agricultural economy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the kind of evidence that we get out of this, foodways, in a sense. How did people produce these animals in terms of manage them? Did they move them around the landscape? What were the animals eating? How large were the herds even? And so that's the underpinning, of course, of economies in the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, is agriculture and animal husbandry. We all think about monuments and architecture and gold masks and stuff like that, but that's just sort of luxury stuff that's on the side. The reason the elites are wealthy is because they own so much land.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so this is what underpins the entire sort of palatial economy in the Bronze Age. It's what underpins the economy in the Iron Age, I mean, into down through the Roman period, the medieval period, until really the Industrial Revolution. That's the underpinning of all human wealth. Mm-hmm. And power and structure around which societies manage themselves. So yeah, so that's that. What by studying animals and food, that gives you an in, let's say, to tackle a lot of different questions. So from economy, but also sort of ritual. So ritual feasting, you could think of. This is how elites bring people together. Is to eat, right? I mean, I don't know if anyone listening are students, but you know how you get food at a party or drinks. That's one of the huge draws, even after a lecture. If it's a good lecture series, you'll have some little like wine and cheese or something like that. And so food is what brings people together, whether it's a holiday or whether it's just a family meal or whatnot. And so therefore, food lets you look at things like religion or everyday life at home, but also not just the production of food. You can think about the distribution of food. These animals go to butchers who then butcher it up, which then either gets sold or given away at a festival or something like that, and then it's cooked in different ways until it ends up on somebody's plate who eats it, and then the bone gets tossed in the midden. And then I look at those bones and try to work the way back to what they can say along each of those steps along the way.
Yeah.
And it's the combo of those steps that makes it foodways. So foodways is the study of the interaction of those different steps, from the production of food through to the consumption of food and the disposal of trash.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, the idea of it's like ultimately you're just digging through garbage and finding this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, we were talking about this before, like it'll be off the microphone, but so just for the listeners generally. But what is really like so interesting is the reality of archaeology and like the really nerdy, weird stuff that you can learn from just like everyday life garbage. Mm-hmm. And I mean, yeah, it's, this series less so than Atlantis, but is still about, kind of debunking some of the myths about the Bronze Age and its collapse. And so, it's obviously less, but I'll remember forever this time I was just like on Instagram and this reel popped up of this, he's like one of those influencer history bros who gives you like a minute worth of history and says it's all true and real. Absolutely. And then, proceeds to spout utter nonsense. And this guy's talking about the Mycenaeans and he's like introducing this whole thing and he's got some accurate stuff about the Mycenaeans. And then he's like, and then one day they just disappeared completely and Greece descended into a dark age. And he said that they lost the ability to read and write. And then from that dark age of no words outsprung Homer, a man who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so like I think about that in relation to this series because it is so about, the end of the Bronze Age. And you've already said Iron Age. So you've already, introduced the idea that there was no Dark Age. There was an Iron Age. But I think about that kind of thing like this, they disappeared out of nowhere. And it's like, well, no. And, we can look at their trash to find out that, no, they didn't just disappear out of nowhere. Like all these different things are going on. And, it's early days in my recording of this series, but still I love this idea. You can dig into some trash and find the truth of things. So like, what do we know about, how this relates to the Bronze Age, what it says about, what they were doing and getting towards, the end of it? Like I want to hear about the Bronze Age itself, but also the kind of transition, that they went through because it was a transition, not a, loss of society entirely.
Yes, I agree. So, a few things. One, I'm agnostic on the term Dark Age, actually.
Okay.
I think that, first of all, it's not just some sort of collapse where everybody disappears. And
they lost the ability to write.
That's ludicrous. I agree with the points that, like, Andonis Koutsanos has a paper on the terminology, the Dark Age, and what that means and the problems with it. And he was on my PhD committee. So, I mean, I mostly agree with him. He did sign my PhD after all. But at the same time, to a certain degree, life does get worse. And we can talk about what the Bronze Age was like, but one way you can track that is through people's diets and through malnourishment that you can see in people's teeth. And so this is not my own studies. It's other people that study human remains. But Savitri Andafilou and others have published on sort of what you get in teeth is if while your teeth are growing, so when you're a child, if you have a period of severe malnourishment, your teeth will sort of stop growing. They'll interrupt their growth for a period of time, and it develops this kind of line that you can see on it. It's called enamel hypoplasia. And so that line is an indication of people that are, they don't get enough food. And that specific pathological marker, that marker of this malnourishment, it shows up more frequently proportionally in many Iron Age populations than Bronze Age. So they are eating, they're more malnourished, at least from the graves that have been excavated and studied more methodically and scientifically. And at the same time, you can see this in isotopic signatures of people. So, for example, certainly I have nothing wrong with people that are vegetarians or vegans. And in this case, I guess it's more vegans because what you can measure is you can measure animal protein consumption. And that shows up in the isotopes in your teeth. Again, it's laid down while you're growing, or in your bones. That's closer to the time of your death because your bones keep remodeling during your life. And again, people in the Iron Age, they're eating less animal protein on average than people in the Bronze Age, though in the Bronze Age, it's very stratified. It's mostly the wealthy men that get a lot of animal protein. In the Iron Age, it's much more even. It looks like everybody eats less. And so there's definitely less wealth, at least just existing, one would think, at least in terms of animal wealth at that time. So this is why I'm kind of a little agnostic about Dark Age. I think certainly writing does disappear, for example. Linear B, the tablets used that we find in Bronze Age, what we call palaces, though that's a really stupid name. But
I know, I try to explain what that means to people because I'm like, they're not. I mean, we call them palaces. It's very palatial, but like also you need to understand what that means, and it's just kind of the word.
Yeah, basically at this point, I think it mostly means a large monumental complex that includes a large courtyard, sometimes adjacent to it, sometimes within it contained. And so they're often, some people want to recall them like courtyard complexes or things related to that, because clearly there are these large complexes, which means lots of rooms, different activities going on. Some have throne rooms, some don't, but that doesn't matter. But then the courtyard means that you can gather a whole lot of people together.
Right.
And so it's these two combos of this evidence for hierarchy and the evidence and the ability to host large groups that sort of makes a palace, if you will. And I think, I'm not sure about this, don't quote me on it, but I guess you're going to quote me on it. It's a podcast. But
you've already prefaced, you're good.
But I think almost all, if not all, of the Linear B tablets, so the actual writings we have, come from what we would label as a palace.
Right.
Certainly most of them do.
Yeah.
So that's some of my take on it. So all right, food. Well, we can say a lot. So these, and a lot of it comes from writing as well, and how it relates to the archaeological evidence can be interesting.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I know you study the bones, but like, I'm interested in how the Linear B tablets that we have like correspond to the food, because obviously, I mean, what I know of Linear B is that, primarily the records that we have are palatial records, are, trades and like food stores and all of these different things that they're just kind of recording, for their own just sort of administrative purposes, which is why Linear B is very cool, but also frustrating because they didn't write down stories, which is just too bad. But like, I want to know how those things kind of relate. Like, do you look at how the bone evidence of food like relates to those, the registers kind of that we have in Linear B?
Yeah, for sure. So thankfully Linear B is well studied and a lot of it's been published, and there's actually been a lot of studies, more probably on foodstuffs in Linear B than of the animal bones themselves.
Yeah,
so it's something that you can go to and read and cite and see how it fits together. And the picture you get from these Linear B tablets is this, it gives a very misleading picture of society. Certain aspects are accurate, but it's misleading in the sense that it's so palatial focused. And so it's really, like you said, their accounts. And so it's goods in and out. And it shows how they control also the larger agricultural economy. But it's only what they're focused on. So the big thing that you can tell when you compare the archaeological record to the written record is there's so much missing in the written record, right? There's a focus on only a few foodstuffs. And so sheep are one of the really big ones. And then wheat is another really, really big one. And olive oil and wine are also reasonably prominent in there. But it ignores everything else, which is, in animals, they also have some mentions of palatial oxyntines for pulling plows.
Okay.
So those are what most of the foodstuffs in the Linear B tablets, the Linear B tablets mostly talk about those foodstuffs and not all the others. They don't talk about, barley, for example, nearly as much, or lesser quality wheats, whole wheats, we call them emmer, einkorn, which were around. They don't talk about all the different diversity of beans, which are really, really important. I know it sounds silly.
I love that diversity of beans.
Yeah, well, there's all these legumes, beans and peas, and they're really important to sort of agriculture because they absorb nitrogen from the air and then fix it in the soil. So wheat depletes grains in general. They deplete all the nitrogen from the soil, while beans bring it back. So beans are extremely important because they regenerate the soil's nitrogen, and at the same time they're very healthy. They provide a lot of calories. They're easy to grow and to eat and prepare and things like that. So we know from our archaeobotanical samples that have been published that beans and peas are eaten all the time, and barley is far more common than wheat in the archaeobotanical record. It grows better in Greek landscape because it's so dry there, which is another key point that we'll get to. And so there's so much missing, and same thing, pigs and goats don't come up very often, and it's just, and even of the sheep, so there's tens of thousands of sheep in the Linear B tablets from Knossos in particular, because there was a huge interest not in the sheep for food but for wool. And so they were making textiles. A lot of tablets focus on the textile economy, including weavers and different people working with textiles. And we believe it was a major export from Minoan Crete, and then later on from the Mycenaean world. I think you'd have to ask Eric, but I think there's this fresco in Egypt where he's published on it, where they're showing, he identifies the people carrying textiles as I think Minoans.
Okay.
And so it's been a while since I've read that paper. So the textiles are big business, and that's what they're interested in. And so what that means is, as a zooarchaeologist, I'm going off on these tangents. As a zooarchaeologist, one of the big questions we ask of our animal teeth and bones is, what are the ages of slaughter of animals? And this will make sense in a second. Yeah. So I promise. And this is an exercise I do with my students all the time, where I say, all right, so why the heck does this matter, right?
Yeah.
So let's play a game here, Liv. You are a goat herder on the island of Crete, and all you care about is milk. You don't care about meat. You don't care about the skins. All you want to maximize is milk production. So what kind of goats do you want in terms of age and sex?
I mean, as a very knowledgeable person on goats, I'm assuming older and female.
Yeah, you want a lot of female because they give birth, which then leads to them, producing milk. But they give birth 50-50 male-female. And you keep a couple lucky guys alive for breeding purposes, but they give birth 50-50 male-female. What do you do with the young males?
Do they just eat them when they're very young?
Yeah, because they're drinking the mother's milk, right? And you want to get as much of that as possible. So, you look at anthropologically, ethnographically, this is what people raising goats or cattle or sheep, if they really want to maximize milk, that's the age and sex profile you'd have for a herd, right? Older females, infant males being slaughtered. Yeah. Now let's shift that up to wool. So now you want to have your woolly sheep on Crete. You want them to maximize their wool production. What do you want?
I mean, I'm assuming that all sheep grow wool and it's not a gendered or thing, but so you just want them all and then you just want them to live as long as possible? I have no idea.
Nobody can see me except for you. I'm giving you a clue.
Well, I mean,
I'm stroking my beard.
Yeah, I was gonna say, let's describe what you're doing. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any idea how sheep grow wool.
Well, so just like
that they do it,
just like I produce more wool.
Yeah.
Male sheep on average. Male sheep on average produce more wool. Okay. So have you ever been to the beach?
Yes.
How?
On Crete, even.
Okay, so when you scope out the beach, looking for potential hookups or whatever it is we all do, and you think about it in terms of wool on backs, who has the most wool on their backs?
Older men.
Okay, the same is true for sheep.
Okay.
The exact same thing is true for sheep. Older male sheep have woolier backs on average, and if you castrate them, they're even woolier. I don't know if that works with humans. I have no idea.
Yeah, no one's really testing that. Fine.
but it is true for sheep. And so we call, agriculturally, if you're a sheep herder or a shepherd and you have you're maximizing wool, you want older male castrated sheep. And older male castrated sheep in English are called wethers, W-E-T-H-E-R. And they're really common throughout traditional agricultural economies if you're looking at wool production. And so that's what you'd be looking for. And that's what the Linear B tablets focus on. They only talk about tens of thousands of wethers, male castrated sheep. And they don't talk about the rest of the herd. And so it's up to us to try to put that back into place. And it seems like, according to Paul Halstead, who studied both these tablets, and he's like the I don't know, he's just retired recently, but he was like the guy who's published the most on sort of Bronze Age Greek zooarchaeology, animal bones. He was also the person who trained me. And so he's pointed out that the way these tablets seem to be working is they're describing tens of thousands of wethers, but they're not all within a herd. In fact, they're controlled by private individuals. And so they're controlling the herd, which includes a few palatial wethers or a certain number of them. And so you can start putting together the larger sheep herd economy by looking at the animal remains, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the palatial stuff misses out on a lot, right?
Yeah,
It's missing the larger picture of what's going on, even if we can understand that the Palus Echinocos controls, castrated male sheep throughout the island. And at Pylos, we have these records showing the control of plow oxen, and they move them around to different places that need plowing. And so there's a lot of administration that goes on to kind of plan out where they are and who they get lent to, I guess, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the sort of way that the palace controls agricultural production, by controlling these plow oxen teams. And same thing with the wethers. And so they focus on these specific goods, and that's what they're sort of focused on. And the archaeological evidence gives us the larger picture, obviously more diversity. But also the relationship is interesting, though, because sheep are the most common animal in the zooarchaeological record, for example. Mm-hmm. Wheat is not in the archaeobotanical, it's barley, but sheep certainly are. And in my study, I studied the site in southwest Greece near Pylos, near the Palace of Nestor of Pylos. It's called Nioria, and we can talk about this one a bunch because it really matters for this transition historiographically. It's been at the center of how scholars have interpreted the change between Bronze Age and Iron Age, and they're all wrong. I'm right. I mean, to a certain degree, most people realize they were all wrong already by the time I published my article. But it's so at Nioria, though, when it starts off in the Middle Bronze Age and in the very beginning of the Late Bronze Age as an independent community, and then by what's called the Late Helladic III period, so around 1650 BCE or so, it becomes dominated by the Palace of Nestor. And it's at that time that we see this shift from pigs being the most common animal to sheep. And what's really cool is the age of slaughter, the sheep gets older and there's more male. So it looks like they're starting to focus more on wool production. It isn't like they're only focused on wool production, though, as those tablets would seem to show. It's part of a more diverse economy, but this change in control has had an impact on Nioria. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, quick nerdy question.
Sure.
We call it the Palace of Nestor. Is that only tied to Homeric tradition, or is there any kind of like name in Linear B?
No. It's just Carl Blagan. It's pretty cool. He found it on the first day, and but then World War II broke out, and he went back and excavated it. But no, it's just because they're 99.9% sure it actually is the site of Bronze Age Pylos,
Right.
and therefore the palace would be Nestor's palace because that's who Homer put as the king of Pylos.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. I just was like, do we have slightly? Is there anything? But I know.
No.
I mean, everything.
And
I do love.
It's
that
not even
everything's
on the
tied to
beach.
Homer.
It's not even on the beach. You know, in the Odyssey, when Telemachus goes there, they sacrifice cattle on the beach. Everything's along the beach and everything. And they call it Sandy Pylos. That's the epithet. There's no sand there. I've dug there. I've spent like many seasons. I don't know, 4 or 5 seasons digging there. I helped find the Tomb of the Griffin Warrior. I was field director then. And there's no sand in sight. It's all a very clay soil. It's really hard to dig through. And I don't know why Homer calls it Sandy Pylos, and it really annoys me. I wish it was sandier. It would have been easier to dig.
Well, I mean, the Odyssey is a little tricky in terms of tracking where or anything is and what it actually looked like in reality. So that makes some sense. You know, the Ithaca of it all. / every other stop on Odysseus's journey. No, that's really interesting. So, okay, I wanted to hear kind of anything about, you know, how we know about this, the food and everything, especially in this palace. But one thing I just can't resist talking about, and I'm so curious about it because I don't know at all how or if it, you know, we have evidence of it, how it affected things. But I am obsessed with the volcanic eruption.
Okay.
And I would imagine that shows up in bones. Like, do we have record of like what kind of was affected? Because to me, it feels like a volcanic eruption of that size would affect agriculture.
Yeah, but in certain areas. So probably on Crete only.
Really?
Yeah, so it was obviously a massive eruption destroying Santorini, and then there's a part of the signature on Crete. Most of what it does actually is so what comes down is tephra, right? And so there are tephra layers that have been excavated, like in eastern Crete at Palicastro, I believe, and elsewhere. And so, but it doesn't seem to have gone, so Santorini's not too far from Crete even. And so it's not like we have any tephra layers on the mainland. Really? And even these tephra layers in on Crete are, you know, they're very ephemeral layers. And so scholars do think when you model it, in a sense, having observed more modern volcanic eruptions and historical descriptions of it, it certainly would have impacted the crops around Crete and around some other Aegean islands in the Cyclades and stuff. Mm-hmm. With tephra coming down, maybe having the sky darker, the sulfur could potentially have cooled the temperature a little bit, but it wasn't some major impact that you can see in people's or animals' bones, or as far as I know from any seeds that have been published. Not to say it would not have had a big impact, but it would have been fairly temporary. Unless of course you lived right there and you died in it and stuff like that. That's of course permanent.
Yeah. Well, I know there was probably like a refuge, I remember whenever I learned about this last, which was probably in school, like refugee crisis kind of thing happening.
Perhaps,
in Crete because people got out, or a lot of them.
I mean, who knows?
Got out,
it's tough to tell, and because we just don't have. So it's mostly so it doesn't really have to do with the end of the Bronze Age either. It's a lot earlier, right? Yeah, several hundred years earlier, and it certainly would have impacted sort of circulation networks in the Cyclades, because Santorini was a really important Akrotiri. I mean, was a very important settlement, and it had important interactions with both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and
it's right in the middle,
the Asia Minor and stuff like that. And it would have been really devastating economically, one would imagine. But yeah, there isn't. It's one of those things that scholars argue about nonstop. Is what kind of impact that really had. And mostly it's tough to detect that archaeologically. Just like Pompeii erupting, that should have had a huge, enormous impact on the Bay of Naples region, right? And the Bay of Naples region was sort of the hotspot for the Roman elite. And so, yet, it's almost like a side mention in history. You know, in the histories that we get, it's an important archaeological find and all this kind of stuff, but it certainly was not something that, and we would imagine refugees and stuff like that from as well. And no descriptions of that made history or anything. Again, no real clear archaeological evidence. And don't believe the recent headlines that they found Pliny the Elder's villa or something like that. That's just
I have not
total
heard of
crap.
That. Yeah.
Total crap.
That's funny. No, it's interesting. I definitely was under the impression that the eruption of Thera was like considerably bigger than Pompeii, I guess. And I just think of like the, historic eruptions of, the whatever the one was where like basically they got a year of darkness like all the way up in the UK, and I think it was a volcano in Indonesia or something. So I just imagine of like just the kind of, because to me, like, I mean, Santorini's far from the mainland, but it's not that far, so I'm just interested to hear that it didn't necessarily
at least not in any
much.
detectable way. I don't think
yeah.
I've ever seen anybody publish tephra from Santorini outside of Crete or ice cores, or closer afield like in the Cyclades. But I don't think I've never excavated any layers at Pylos or Mycenae where I've excavated or elsewhere. And I've never, as far as I know, I could be wrong, but I don't think there's anything like that on the mainland. It doesn't mean that there's not impacts, but it's just we don't know. Right?
Yeah, of course, It's no, I would have assumed it affected like crop growth in some kind of way, but maybe in sort of, if it did, it was just undetectable or something. I don't know. I'm obsessed
and
with
if enough tephra are falling on Crete that you're getting a clear layer of it, that could kill a lot of crops. But it would only be for a season. So as long as you have some stuff stored, you recover the next season, you get trade and other things, and probably some people die, of course, because that's what happens. Unfortunately, that's what archaeologists. Volcanoes. That's how we find stuff. But but yeah.
No, interesting. Okay, yeah. So what do we? You mentioned when we get into the getting into the bronze to the Iron Age, that there's a lot more of like this malnutrition and stuff. So do we know of like what kind of? I mean, I guess it'd be hard to tell what kind of caused that, but like other than just that, there's obviously different food happening and things. But I just love to hear about what we know about that transition of like what changes that we know kind of were happening.
Yeah, so let's start with the traditional picture, or what was the picture from the 80s until about, I don't know, 10 years ago-ish. Because that's what people still come across mostly in most of the literature, especially if it's not like you're not up to date. So basically, it's pretty clear that something happens. Palaces disappear, monumental structures, art. Trade still seems going strong if you read Sarah Murray's book on trade between the Bronze and the Iron Age. There's still a lot of trade going on, and her surveys in Eastern Attica are showing that as well. But what you do see is this total shifting towards more of a regional economy. And there is this evidence of somewhat people are living a different kind of lifestyle. There's not the same kind of hierarchy. Whether that's good or bad is a different question. Like I said, in the Bronze Age, the elites were the ones benefiting from that hierarchy, right? And they were the ones eating well while nobody else was, including their wives and their children. And so, we can tell this from isotope tests of people from Tholos tombs around Pylos, even. And so in the Iron Age, for a long time, people, because of Nioria, the site that I mentioned, I restudied these bones. This is one of the first sites where animal bones were ever studied in the Greek world. It was one of the first scientific excavations out of the University of Minnesota, where they had collaborated with Carl Blagan, excavating Pylos. And at Pylos, by the way, some of the animal remains have been published by Valisi Izakidou and Paul Halstead. They show large-scale feasting and animal sacrifice even then, right? And in the Linear Beast archive room is actually where the big assemblage of sacrificial stuff is. Just weird little point of bones and text together,
Yeah.
And so it seems like it was a record of the sacrifice because they deposited these jaw bones and leg bones from cattle and red deer there, like as a record of the sacrifice.
Wow.
It's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So it's bones as a record.
Yeah.
And so this project at Nioria happens in the 70s. It's the first time people are studying seeds and animal remains and doing soil studies and this kind of stuff. And it's really cool. And they got this paleontologist who studies dinosaurs to go study these bones because he worked at Minnesota, and he notices that there's a lot more cattle in the Iron Age than in the Bronze Age. In the Bronze Age, is sheep. It's pig and sheep, depends, like I said. And he says they all became cowboys. They went. No, seriously. In his autobiography, he says this, and so and this is what started this idea that the change from the Palatial period to the Dark Age is this shift from civilized agriculture to sort of less civilized pastoralism.
Okay.
Right? And
Right.
so I shouldn't make it sound so pejorative because a lot of smart people worked on this, but but I think they're wrong. And
no, it's just still like it's time, it's just things change over time, and the way we structure these things and understand anything changes. So it makes sense. It doesn't lessen the original findings.
And so Anthony Snodgrass sort of looked around. He was the guy who really started early Iron Age studies. And in Greece, he coined a lot of the terminology and periods and how to think about them. And so he put together what he calls the pastoral hypothesis. In a sense, people start living in more ephemeral structures. We see this shift from wheel-made pottery to hand-made pottery. We see this shift from sort of agriculture to cattle. And that the reason behind all this stuff is because they've shifted towards pastoralism. Mm-hmm. And this is what dominated, like I said, for a few decades, the thinking on this. And it only was about 10 years ago when the first book on archaeodiet and isotopic studies it shows that actually people are eating less animal protein at that time. Mm-hmm. And so my restudy of these bones at Nioria, they basically showed that the reason why there's more cattle has nothing to do with humans. It has to do with the fact that the soil is more acidic in the higher levels of the site. And so smaller animals, their bones didn't survive as well, while cattle survived. And I've mapped this all out spatially. Like you have some areas where there's no early Iron Age occupation, so it's just late Bronze Age at the top. And in those little areas, cattle are still the more dominant animal, even in the late Bronze Age, because they're worse preserved, those bones. And so, so that's what my article at Dan Fallu is about, is sort of the myth of this beef ranching. And no other site in the Iron Age that's been published since then by me or others shows cattle as the dominant animal. There's no real evidence for a pastoral economy. It looks like an agricultural economy continues. It's just more impoverished. We don't see this sort of upcycling of stuff. And so that's sort of what happens. And if you think about Homeric epic now, so how does this picture of the early Iron Age animal husbandry and foodstuffs and food ways, how does it relate to what we see in Homer? And I call it food pornography.
I remember you mentioned that when we talked about Atlantis, and it's funny because you're saying this in my head originally, like before you said that actually it's the cattle because the bones survive, but I'm thinking, well, Homeric epic is all cattle.
I should have mentioned that. That was a big part of his thing too. He's like, and Anthony Snodgrass and others are like, we read about it. This is what they're doing. They're stealing cattle. They're cattle rustling, and they're cowboys.
Yeah,
and exactly.
Well, everything they sacrifice is cattle, and because I was already thinking when you're talking earlier about how many sheep there were, I was like, well, there's like no sheep in the epic, which is just interesting. So that's really interesting because it does seem like a very cattle heavy people. Of course, in terms of where we're really interacting with that stuff, it's over in, quote unquote Troy. But that's really interesting because it does feel like that would fit. But then it sounds like it doesn't. They did have
not at all, and it's not only in Troy. At Pylos, they sacrifice 100 cattle, and then they have that. That's the long scene.
It's always
it's at Pylos. Yeah, it's hecatombs of cattle, and that's where they describe in detail in Book 3 the sacrifice of the cow. They gild the horns. All the women chant as they bring the axe down, and all this kind of stuff. And so that's like the big sacrificial scene. Actually, mostly comes from the Odysseys. And a lot of feasting does as well on Ithaca and elsewhere. And so,
true.
But they're always eating cattle, and and they're eating a lot of meat. It's like just like meat on meat on meat, which I love and I study, but it's not what you see. I think that this is what I call. I gotta finish this article one day on the zooarchaeology of epic poetry, where I think for if we consider Homer a real person, or let's just say, when the story was heard by people in the early Iron Age, they were probably salivating. This is like descriptions of amazing food that they don't have access to. On the other hand, when this story is told in classical Athens and they're having huge sacrifices, they're saying we're arranging our sacrifices to honor how Homer said that our ancestors made sacrifices. So it informs how they do things later on. And so you can think about how Homeric poetry is the reception of it by ancient people, and especially because so much of it is food, how their diet is going to impact how they're going to sort of hear and understand and interpret the poem and these stories, right? So that's one way that it relates, is the cattle. You can also look at how sacrificial rituals arrange themselves, where in a sense, I mentioned it at the Palace of Nestor, it's sort of this jawbone and then the femur and the humerus, so the upper forelimb and hind limb, front leg and back leg of the animal. And over time, it becomes much more orthodox in what you burn for the gods. So you've read some Homer. What body part do you burn for the gods?
Well, I know it's always, I guess Homer, I'll have trouble defining what's in Homer versus what's just sort of the
Doesn't matter.
mythos. But yeah, it's the idea that, like, because of Prometheus, you burn like the fatty stuff for the gods, basically the stuff you don't want to eat, and then you eat
so Hesiod describes it as Hesiod describes it as it's a trick. So it's a big trick where they kill the cow and then they make two portions: the meat wrapped in the hides, and then the bones wrapped in the fat. And then Zeus comes down, and he's like, "I want that one," even though he knows it's a lie. And so that's why Hesiod, the way he ends it, is like, that's why we burn fat wrapped bones on the altars of the gods.
Yeah.
Okay, but Homer's more specific. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, dozens of times, think about it, there's a specific bone that he burns.
Oh.
Very specific. And don't worry, it's accurately translated almost all the time.
Yeah, no, I've not registered the bone enough.
Next time you read some Homer, pay attention to the thigh bones.
Okay.
It's always the thigh bone that's burned, the Myria in ancient Greek. And that's the portion, and it's always fat wrapped, so that connects to Hesiod. And then, but what we have archaeologically, like I said, in the Bronze Age, it's more complicated. We have burning of bones. In fact, at the Mount Lycaon, the ash altar there, in the Bronze Age layers and all the way down, it's burnt thigh bones, mostly of sheep. At Halismenos on Crete, where I've published it, in the late Minoan period, it's the lower legs and heads of sheep and cattle. And same at Iron Age Nioria. And then at Pylos, like I mentioned, it's the jawbone, the forelimb, and the thigh bone. Yeah. And then I do need to remember the name of that site. And
where is it?
Ios Konstantinos on Mathena, on the peninsula of Mathana, and at these Bronze Age layers at Eleusis, it's also the feet and the heads, but of pigs. And so we have all this diversity of bones being burned. And slowly, over time, it takes about a millennium, but by about 500 BC or so, it's pretty much only the thigh bones that are burned. And so that goes back to, again, I think it has to do with the reception of Homer. As Homer becomes more popular, people see that as the orthodox of how we do our religious rituals and refer to it. They become more orthodox in what they burn on their altars, and it's just thigh bones eventually.
Yeah.
And so,
Oh, it's so interesting. I mean, see, this is why I'm thrilled to have Joel come on to talk about the Homeric interactions, because, like, I mean, it's really fascinating the way that they would mirror so many things off of Homer, with the understanding that, like, it was, the Bronze Age kind of thing, or like what we now think of as the Bronze Age. Like, it's just fascinating.
Oh, yeah. And that's why it's silly to think of Homer as describing the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. It's a weird mishmash of both. And, people like Sue Sharratt, I guess she just I forget if she's emeritus or not at Sheffield. She's published on this, the direct relationship between archaeology and Homeric epic, and how you can find chronological markers in there. And so,
cool.
So what they have is like the type of spear that they use, or the type of shield they use. We can compare that to spears and shields that we have from iconography and in graves and stuff like that. And so Homer uses both the shields and the spears from both the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And there's one scene that she describes, I forget where a hero grabs at first the Bronze Age style spear, and then the very next line it's an Iron Age style spear. And so just from the description of the spear, it's not like there's a different word, it's the way the spear is being used and described matches one or the other, like the physical nature of it. And so Homeric epic poetry does not pay very clear attention. It just takes a bit from both, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because because the thing about it, and Joel was on my show a couple of years ago to talk about this, but the whole, I mean, obviously there's so much complexity to oral storytelling, but like ultimately what we have that survives was just written down at some point,
Yeah.
and that's the version that we have, but there would have been so many other versions, and
Yeah.
it was probably written down in the archaic period in Athens, and so it's so completely like tied to that time period in addition to everything else, because you're dealing with like 500 or 600 years of storytelling then being written down into the only thing that we have. Like,
Exactly.
Yeah. It's so interesting to look at it all that way. And I mean, I love the idea of just how many other versions could have existed, or like, how different they were when they were actually being, sung to people 500 years earlier. Like, things we'll never know. I want a time machine.
Okay, so what we have left to do, though, is
Right.
I've explained the older hypothesis, this kind of shift to pastoralism, but there's like a whole new thing that I've been putting forth and other people have been putting forth, which is that a lot of it has to do with climate change.
Right.
So this is not me being woke or something
You're on
like
the
that.
Right show, it's fine. We do not deny even a single thing about climate change on this show.
No, I know, but I mean, but I guess the point is a lot of this just has to do with the fact that there's more evidence out there for things like climate change. So with the fact that climate is changing today due to human causes, there's been a lot more research funds that have gone towards understanding past climate change. And so, that we've reached a critical mass in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Aegean, and the Greek world specifically, that we now understand that the climate does get drier between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. This drying of the climate starts not right at the collapse point, though, so it's not some sort of inflection. All of a sudden, there's a mega drought. Some scholars have called it that, because originally it was identified as the 3.2 Ka event, so from 3,200 years ago or 1,200 BCE. Right.
Okay.
And so, and it's still called that. And it does.
It's wordy.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense though, because you have to date everything from before present if you're doing scientific dating. And the other reason for it is because there's also a 4.2 K event and an 8.2 K event. For some reason, there's a lot of periods of sharp climate change at the 0.2 periods years ago. It's really weird. It's the type of thing I'm surprised conspiracy theorists have not jumped on, because it's like a totally weird coincidence.
It's not as exciting. They need it to be, they've got to put aliens in there.
Climate change
What you're saying is that at the 0.2 years, the aliens have come down and they have, made these major changes to Earth's climate.
No, I'm not saying that at all. But no, and it's not every 0.2 either. It's just
but that's really interesting.
So about 1,200 years ago, it gets more rapidly drier. But this drying transition
3,200 years ago
started. 3,200 years ago. Sorry, started actually before that. So somewhere around 1,500 BCE, I think. So there's a team out of Uppsala University, Erica Weiberg and Martin Finet and Anton Bonnier, who have been working on this in the Peloponnese in detail. And I published a few things with them. And they've been putting together all these climate records and then comparing them to regional surveys and stuff. And so what they seem to show is that when the climate first starts getting drier, about 1500 BC, the first response that humans make is so there's different ways you can adapt to climate change if you think about it, like agriculturally speaking. And one of it is to intensify. So start growing more in more areas. So this is where you start seeing from regional surveys more dots on the map and in more marginal landscapes. So they're trying to intensify their production, even areas that we don't farm today, sort of on steeper slopes. They've measured this in terms of slope steepness. And so, that's the first attempt. And we see this as a period, though, of cultural flourishing. This is the waxing of the palatial Bronze Age. Sorry, I never talk like this.
I love it.
But this is what you think of as like the Bronze Age with palaces and linear B. This is a period where it's starting to get drier, though. And so they're trying to adapt by intensifying, and then it's really tough to tell what kind of impact this climate change has had on sort of the palace structure itself. It clearly would not have been, a direct impact. It would have impacted food, which then would have impacted economic stuff, which then would have had other impacts on society. And eventually we see this, inflection point around what Eric Klein would say 1178 BC, right? Obviously, that's way too precisely dated, but whatever. It's 1177. What am I saying? And so,
it's the book title.
Come on. So but around the 12th century BCE, we start seeing more of these palaces burning. However, those sites stay in occupation a little longer. More recent excavations at Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and elsewhere. Knossos, of course, never has an abandonment. And so clearly people are not just disappearing. And it's a slower transition into what you'd think of as an early Iron Age economy. And what we're seeing, so Martin Finet, he's a paleoclimatologist at Uppsala, and he does so you piece together the climate through looking at pollen. You can drill cores into lake beds where pollen survives.
So scientific. I love it.
Those sediments, they accumulate in layers, and each of those layers is essentially a year or something like that. And you drill these cores down, you look at the landscape from the pollen that's in there, and so you can see changes in sort of dryness or humidity or temperature based on which types of natural, wild plants show up in there. And but Martin, he studies speleothems, which are stalactites or stalagmites in caves. And so you cut a cross section of them. They're formed from dripping of water. So the water dissolves the calcium in the bedrock, and then as it drips, it sort of accumulates and solidifies. And since it's formed in these kind of layers, again through the dripping, that's why you have that sort of conical shape to these stalactites and stalagmites. You can sort of take a cross section of them, and then you can test them with oxygen isotopes and other isotopes that will tell you about precipitation. And so that's actually a more direct understanding of what's going on with precipitation specifically. And while of course pollen looks at the wild plants, which gives you a sense of how plants are reacting. And so it's tough to understand, though, what the change in precipitation is, right? Is this like 5 millimeters of rainfall, in which case maybe humans can shrug it off, or is it 20? And how is that different in different regions and things like that, right? And so that's where what I wanted to do is I wanted to see if humans adapted to this climate change. And can we find any evidence that the people living there, they wanted to adapt their sort of animal economy to it? And so what I found is, yes, very clearly they do. There's this shift from sheep to goats, but only in eastern areas of the mainland in Crete. And the reason for that is because if you look at a topographic map of Greece, there's a mountain range that runs right down the middle, and the western half of Greece and Crete gets twice as much rainfall as the eastern half. So in the areas where they were more at risk from a drier climate, the eastern half, that's when they had to adapt by shifting from sheep to goats. And so I published that with about 15 sites 15 sites in each period. And now I've just zoomed in on Crete. My big research project is called Zoocrete, and I've picked out 45 different sites in Crete, and you can see this shift over time. And it's really clearly eastern versus western, and it's very, very clearly therefore correlated with rainfall. Yeah. And so that tells me that, and I hope others, that this climate change was not just something that's showing up in a really, in a really sensitive scientific study. This would have been enough that people felt the need to adapt to it. And so it was very much impacting their what their crop outputs and animal outputs were. Not enough archaeobotanical studies have been done from the Iron Age and Bronze Age to really put together a global picture, a complete picture of these periods and contrast them. Only a few Iron Age sites have been studied. More on that, I hope, eventually from colleagues. But but what's happening also is it's a very slow change. So it doesn't happen immediately almost anywhere. It takes several hundred years for people to adapt. And so that also suggests they struggled with it. So like at Nioria, they never really do. It goes,
Right.
like if you ignore that shift to cattle, they're still very sheep heavy. They are also in the West, so that might be part of it. So they're
Yeah.
maybe not as impacted, but yeah, most areas it seems like it takes several centuries for this shift towards goats. And one of the things that I'm trying to think about is how that impacts then developments to the next period, because the next period, of course, is Archaic Greece. And you think about it, I describe this as it's adaptive, but it also shows that every area is responding differently in a unique sort of heterogeneous way. And that sort of mimics this next period of the establishment of city-states, right? Where it's a very heterogeneous, regional sort of cultural and economic way of people managing themselves, but they're all in these Greek city-states. And so I'm wondering if this kind of regionality that we see in ceramics, it also has to do with agriculture and food production, and if it's this shift in economic production that helps lead to these cultural changes that we call, the development of city-states and things like that. And these different political economies. So that's what I would say is sort of happening now, or what what a lot of us think is happening now. So yeah.
That's really interesting. It's so funny. I mean, I just associate Greece with goats so much that I'm interested in hearing that transition. Exactly. Like, I mean, I've been to Samothraki and I've been to Crete, and it's like those are my goat islands in my head. Like, I mean, I've definitely seen them, on a lot of other like Cycladic islands. But I just, in my head, it's just like they're so tied together. Like goats are just so Greek to me. But I love hearing about their rainfall. This is like very niche connection, but like, so I live on the west coast of Canada. I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live in this general realm where everyone assumes that the whole thing we have all the time, all day, every day is rain, right? Like Seattle and Vancouver, the rainiest places imaginable. And they like are sort of surround where I live, Victoria, the island, Vancouver Island. But Vancouver Island has this big mountain called the Malahat, and everything south of the Malahat, which is like only a short ways up our very, very large island, everything south of the Malahat gets about, I mean, I don't know the scientific number, but like just anecdotally having lived in Vancouver and Victoria, like Victoria and the South Island gets probably 60 to 70% less rain than Vancouver and Seattle, and even north of that mountain, because we call it our rain shadow. I don't know if it's like a thing broadly, but like we live in this little rain shadow where like everyone assumes it's raining all the time, but really, especially as climate change progresses, like Victoria gets very little rain compared to the other places, and we just live in this nice little bubble. So I'm like, oh, I have this kind of like, I know how that can happen and how it like affects the difference. And like, it can really just be like just that little shift of there's a mountain there, and the amount of like rainfall is so affected. And I'm deeply unscientific. So, but I love the idea that I can just like connect that. I'm like, oh yeah, I know how that works just from living here.
That's really important because, I mean, when you've been to Greece, right? And it's such a heterogeneous landscape. You have coasts and mountains, upland plateaus and coastal plains. You have, the whole set of kind of different biomes. Yeah. And so, we need to understand this on a very precise regional and micro-regional scale, right?
It's so diverse there. Like I just have to say, like one of the things that stood out to me most, like I've been to a lot of Greek islands now, and not as much on the mainland, but like I went to Samothraki a couple years ago, and that island to me is like, from my experience, it is the most diverse. Like, have you been there at all?
No, I've never been to Samothraki. No. I wish.
I mean, it's utterly wild. Wild is the only word to use to describe it. I mean, the goats alone. But like, most of the island is like very typical Greek. It's very dry and arid, and there's this big mountain. Like the island like is Mount Fangari, and then but there's this one little spot of this very small island where just one face of the mountain is like a rainforest. And there's like, waterfalls and rivers, and the plants that you go, like there's this town called Therma, and then the river is Phonias, and you can go to this like gorge area, and it's like a different world. It's like the trees are completely different. Everything is so green and wet and luscious. And then you leave this like tiny little square of the island and you were on typical Greek where everything is so dry and mountainous and it's like brown and there's just goats everywhere. And it's fascinating to me because Samothraki is one of the smallest islands, like, and it just like this complete difference just on this one place. So I can only imagine, you know, what exists in the wider Greek world that I haven't seen yet. But I'm also just obsessed with Samothraki, so clearly I could talk about it forever.
But I want to pop your bubble, or pop your myth bubble for a second about these goats.
Yeah.
So this is a myth. This is like cattle's in Homer.
What do you mean a myth? What
I mean that this is a myth. Your association of Greece with goats. So let me tell you a story.
Well, I listen, but I want to say, how many I've seen them.
I know, but I'm going to prove it to you. Wait, do you eat meat? I forget.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's important. So, all right. I gave a lecture. I studied all these goats from Nioria and Crete, and it was called Goats and Other Animals in Nioria. And I went to the internet and I asked for pictures of goats to illustrate my point. And I got so many amazing goat pictures, mostly from Greek archaeologists, but really people all over the world because goats are so photogenic. It's why
the goats I have from Samothraki are incorrect. The horns on some of them, because they're all wild and they're like
feral.
Yeah. Okay, feral. Got it.
Feral. They were domesticated and they went feral. Yeah. But yes, and you need to send me some of those so I can integrate them into my lectures. But it was only after I did this and asked for sheep and cattle from my Twitter followers, and nobody could send me any good photos, that I realized that these goats from all over the world, they're highly visible because people let them roam. Right? So they're very visible and people like them, so they notice them and see them and photograph them. They end up going viral online, and that's why you see all these articles every year like, the year of the goat, everybody's going crazy about baby goats online. You know, you go to BuzzFeed and whatnot. They are. But they don't represent the actual animal economy in modern Greece. Right, it's still mostly sheep. So if you go into a taverna, what do you order? You order lamb or do you order goat?
Yeah.
And so
it's all lamb, yeah.
And so this is just what you're seeing because the sheep are being raised in a more sort of constricted way. Yeah. They are what's, on agricultural fields that you don't go and visit. You're not going to the farms of Greece where most of those sheep are. Instead, you're up at the archaeological sites and in the forests or at the beach where goats might sometimes roam by because they just sort of roam around. And
now I have to tell you a bit more about the Samothracian goats.
That's a different story because they're feral goats, yeah.
Well, exactly. And Samothrace feral goats, like, I think I read this number somewhere once, but they outnumber people 10-1 on Samothraki. Like, the goats are wild. You literally cannot exist in the outdoors on Samothraki unless you're in, like, the town without hearing goats everywhere around you all the time. It's incredible. But Samothraki is also the only place I've ever seen sheep. And so, like, I was staying in this hotel.
Except for a butcher shop.
Well, yes, exactly. Live sheep. No, I was staying in this hotel in, like, all of Samothraki. Like, there's just a road all the way around the island because it's a mountain in the middle. And so everything is basically on the coast. And so from my hotel, I can see the coast and you can, like, I walked this long street that goes around the island to, like, get to the closest restaurant. So I, like, walked this strip along the water, like, so many times. And one time I was coming back to my hotel and I'm walking along and there is just an entire, like, herd of sheep and this shepherd guy who's there with a truck and his shepherd crook. And I was like, this is the most iconic thing I've ever seen. Like, but he'd brought his herd of sheep to the beach and they were, like, just grazing somewhere. And I was really obsessed with, like, okay, but he has so many of them. Like, how does he get them back? And I was, like, so interested in this farmer and his sheep and they're on the beach and it's so cool. And then, so I, like, go back to my hotel room to decide, I'm going to watch. I want to see, like, what this guy does. But I get distracted because the sheep are on this beach and then directly behind the sheep, dolphins start, like, breaching, like, literally probably 10 to 20 feet off the coast, directly behind this herd of sheep. And I'm just staring at this thing like, what am I even watching right now? I've got dolphins behind a herd of sheep in front of me. And I got so distracted by the dolphins, I didn't catch how the guy herded all his sheep back to wherever the heck he was. Because I had been, like, there for a week and never seen a single sheep because of all the goats, except when he brought them in. So it definitely proves your point, but also It's just one of my favorite memories from Samothraki. It's the craziest island. Like, it's another world entirely. But yeah, I did see domesticated sheep and a lot of feral goats.
A lot of feral goats. I mean, feral goats are on Crete too, and it's
yeah.
I mean, but even the ones that are domesticated are problems. Like, we had a lot of problems with them climbing our fences and getting onto the site, so that the students excavating, they'd enter the trench every morning to goat turds, and so you know. It creates problems with scientific sampling. It creates all kinds of issues, but you can't really control goats because they're able to climb pretty much anything. And so, you know,
why they work so well on mountainous Greece, but also
and it also means when you start hitting a recession and stop doing as much investment into agricultural wild spaces, goats can just take over, like on Samothraki, and it's a real problem there. But yeah, they are a myth in that sense. They mostly raise them for feta. So most of the feta you eat is goat's cheese, and then most of the animal that you eat is often lamb, unless it's adult, in which case some butchers or restaurants, they might occasionally give you goat when they say it's sheep. That can happen too. Yeah.
I mean, I've definitely seen goat on the menu. I have not chosen to eat it.
Oh, it's good.
But I mean, I'm not like a big adventurous meat person, I'll admit, though in Greece I am more so I probably should. But no, it's interesting because I associate, when it comes to at least Greece and Greek food, I associate goat with the milk, with feta, and then cheese broadly. It's a lot of goat cheese over there. Interesting.
But you should, if you're ever in Greece for something like Smoky Tuesdays, Stiknopempti, or Easter or something like that, I mean, it's just lamb everywhere, all over. And so, I mean, you know, they really are a lamb eating culture rather than a goat eating culture.
Yeah, definitely. No, the only place I've really seen goat on the menu is like in Crete, which I know it's big.
It's all over. Yeah. It's all over, but it's good. Goat is great. They sometimes do it with old goat, but you can also get young goat. And I've never had bad goat. It's good, and it's a little gamier. But it's when they know if they know how to cook it, they'll make it really delicious.
I mean, Greek food, they know how to cook.
Yeah,
those people. Oh.
But maybe you don't want to go out and cook a goat.
No, they're going to do it for me. I don't cook a lot of animal meat. I just get people to do it for me. That's my thing. It's just, I mean, this is so fascinating because I just never think about this side of it, the interactions with animals, let alone the study of bones to figure out this kind of thing. Like, is there more? I mean, obviously there's so much more, but like, is there more particularly that you want to share when it comes to this, like the Bronze Age associations and you know, that transition, or really anything fun about Bronze Age and food?
This ain't Bronze Age per se. It's more like what we can think about coming next. Okay. So in a sense, I've mentioned at a few points things like isotope studies, right? So you can take isotopes from people's teeth and bones, and it tells you about diet and stuff like that. So you can look at how much animal consumption or different kinds of plants people are eating, stuff like that. But you can also do that with animals. And so this is what I'm doing right now, is you can actually take samples from the teeth or the bones of animals, and you can understand their diet. And even better, if anyone was paying a lot of attention, I mentioned that at some point those speleothems, those stalactites and stalagmites, they use sometimes oxygen isotope can tell you about seasonal or precipitation or weather patterns, climate patterns. So you can do this on the tooth of a sheep or goat. Unlike most human teeth, sheep and goat teeth or cattle teeth, they grow up, and the way I'm making signs to you with my hands, but nobody can see them.
No, I always normally I remember, but now I'm like just in. I'm like, oh, this teeth shape.
So the way that these teeth grow is it's one layer of enamel at a time, right? Okay. And so if we sample a tooth horizontally and we take several samples up a tooth, what we end up with is a signature of what this animal is eating during different seasons of the year.
Yeah.
Right? And so we can correlate that using oxygen. And then the carbon signature, which we get at the same time from the mass spectrometer from the same sample, tells us about the type of plants that the animal is eating. And so what that tells us is how these animals are managed seasonally. So when you think about modern day agriculture, you see all these goats. Do you have a sense of how they're herded between uplands and lowlands seasonally?
I only associate it with Samothraki, where they're just fucking everywhere. They're doing their own thing. They don't give a shit.
Fucking feral goats everywhere.
Everywhere.
Okay, so traditionally,
Yeah.
these sheep and goat and other animals, they're oftentimes, so if you think about it, they're in the uplands in the summer when it's cooler and the uplands are more lush, and they're in the lowlands in the winter. That's sort of modern animal husbandry. And there's been this debate that's been raging between ancient historians and archaeologists for about 100 years. And it's called the agro-pastoral debate. And it's about, a big chunk of it is about whether they move their animals up and down seasonally. And so now we can start to answer this kind of question by doing this isotope study up a tooth to see what they're eating and where they're going from the geological signature seasonally. And so that's going to be able to tell us a lot more. I've started getting results from Azoria. So that's Iron Age and Archaic, but there's no Bronze Age animals there. And then a collaborator of mine, Valencia Izakilu, has published some from Bronze Age Knossos. And I am going to Greece next week. I'm working with her, and I'm grabbing material with a permit from the Ministry of Culture and everything like that. I'm not just taking it with me.
I appreciate the warning. I would have assumed.
And I have a conservator that's going to inspect what I do, and I'll be discussing how I sample it, and I have an official permit and everything. And I'll be taking material back here in Cardiff in order to do this analysis on material from Iron Age, and then classical period and Roman period sheep and goat from Knossos. So we'll have a record from the Bronze Age to the Roman period soon at Knossos that could maybe be talking about in more detail how this animal management adapts and responds and drives cultural changes and relates to climate change and things like that. And so we'll really have a clearer understanding of that. It between those periods at a few of these sites. And if I get more funding, I'll do it at more sites, like places like Athens and elsewhere, because I think it's important to reach this level of resolution, if you will. You know, if we want to really understand how humans adapt to sort of climate change, one thing I can say is they take way too long. That clearly
we can tell that right now.
Yeah, we can tell that right now. I mean, this is an article I want to write for some magazine. Is like, you know, when you look at these shifts in the Greek world, they tell us that people took too long. They clearly recognize that the climate was changing, and it's funny how we're mimicking this intensification. We're just growing our economy, but you know, at some point we're going to have to start thinking about changing our diversity. So that's this guy Mac Marston, who teaches at BU. He wrote this article on different ways people can adapt to climate change, and one is intensification, the other one is diversity, biodiversity, and diversify strategies even. So you don't just do the same strategy, you do different kinds of strategies in different places. And so, you know, we're going to have to start thinking about that today, and we need to act faster because, you know, we look at the Iron Age of Greece, and even though I agree calling it a dark age is silly, it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, there were more people that were malnourished. There were people that were not eating as well, and there are no elites at all. You know, like you get these stories of elites that want to build a bunker and survive, and then they ask, what can I do when my guards have guns and I don't? And it's like, well, dude, if you want to look at some history so you can inform yourself, when you look at collapse is a stupid term. Collapse literally just means the collapse of the elites. Yeah. When we think of cultural collapses and civilizational collapses, it's the elites who get fucked.
Yep.
Just as much as everyone else. And the elites disappear, right? They get eaten and become the poor as well. And so, you know, if
the angry leftist is just like, yeah, that's fine.
Like if there's some billionaire listening who wants to build a bunker, screw that, fuck that. Work to help society as a whole mitigate and adapt to climate change, because we're all going down together.
Yep. And your billions aren't going to matter then.
Nope.
So
nothing
they
matters.
Don't matter now. So maybe just fucking use them correctly instead of
Yeah.
Zuckerberg, we're talking to you. That's a particularly interesting. I'm glad we have that connection to modern climate change, because if you think they took too long back then and they did not have the human made impacts of climate change that we have now. And we are the evidence is there. We're fucked.
Yeah. I mean, Well, I mean, look, I refuse to be a doomer about it. I mean, the reality is that
It's okay.
people have adapted, and we can adapt if we can somehow get the will to do it,
Well, that's
And
the thing. It's not about the people. It's about the elite wanting to do
yeah.
it, right? Like,
And I mean, look,
I would love to, but I have no control over that.
some notes of optimism is that lots of countries are decarbonizing at, not as fast as we need, but it's moving along. And that's important to acknowledge because that builds up economies of scale, makes it cheaper to decarbonize for other people. And to be honest, if you think about it long term, it's capitalists should want to decarbonize. It's a lot cheaper to use renewable energy sources than to have to mine into the ground and transport them all over the world. Like, that costs money. So, like, I think we will decarbonize, and there's lots of efforts to adapt things like mostly in wealthier countries, of course, agricultural systems, and to build flood barriers and to adapt to rising sea levels. But I definitely think we need to think more about food as well, because to be honest, we talk about like more intense storms and we talk about rising sea level, but what's really impacting people today from climate change that is already happening is food. That's why we see famines. That's why we see refugee crises. That's why we see there's people that have speculated with good evidence, not just crappy speculation, that, the wars in Syria, for example, started with famines, which were caused basically by climate change, or at least made a lot worse. And so, already today, if we want to be thinking about what's really impacting most people, it's food. It's the price of food, it's the availability of food. It's our ability to grow and distribute food. That is what underpins our society and our ability to live. So we got to fix that up and make it work better. It also contributes to carbon as well. All the fertilizers we use, the ways in which we produce animals.
Factory farming in North America specifically.
Yeah. And so
Alberta, we're talking to you a lot today. Between the oil and the factory farming province. It is reassuring. There's some positive, hopefully. I have trouble with trusting any capitalist government, but I'd like to think that maybe things will change.
Yeah.
For us today. But it's so interesting to look at these past examples of what was happening. Like, I think we often don't think about that because human-made climate change now is so much faster, and it, like, we are dealing with so much of that now that it's interesting to look back on the stuff that did happen naturally.
And we have to. It's silly not to look to the past to understand how we can respond. I know that some archaeology has some relevance with something called lithic mulching. So for a long time in Southwest America, you see sort of Southwest indigenous farms, archaeologically, and there's sort of terraces, and it's like, how are people growing in the middle of the desert, right? And what you see oftentimes is this scattering of stones in the soil. And we know they're growing there because we have pollen and archaeobotanical stuff. We have terraces and houses and other structures there. And the way they're able to do that is through something called lithic mulching, where when you put stones in the soil, the stones help retain moisture. You could think about this if you go outside today and on a drier day, and you pick up a rock, the soil right under the rock is wetter than the soil that's right next to it. And so, and lithic mulching, the more archaeologists look at it, we find it in indigenous cultures all over the world, right?
I bet,
and so now people are starting to adapt that to modern farming in areas that are getting drier. And so we should definitely be looking to the past to start thinking about how to, look, how often have humans had to deal with climate change? Obviously a lot over the span of thousands and thousands of years, but it's only this one event in our own lifetime. So, if we want to understand different ways that human societies have adapted, I think we have to look to the past. And it's so silly that we see things like all these cuts to things like archaeology and humanities and stuff like that, because how do we contextualize major changes? There's no way to do that. Economists look to the past with stock performance. People who comment on sports look to the past with statistics, what they're doing. We got to do the same thing with humans. We look to the past to inform our own decisions, to provide context to why we make decisions. And so, just because ours is anthropogenic climate change does not make it the end point could be drastically different as climate change goes faster and more severe than ever before. But obviously, we want to work to mitigate that. That's the goal, is to decarbonize and mitigate that. And so, but at the same time, there's some amount of climate change that's cooked in, let's say. And so we should be looking in the past for ways that we can mitigate that or adapt to it, is what I mean. Sorry.
Yeah.
And obviously things like lithic mulching, but also the evidence for biodiversity from past food production. If you go to Pompeii, for example, and you walk around, you might notice there's these weird concrete things that kind of look like a platform with like spider legs underneath it.
Oh. Sorry, I was just there, but now I'm like, oh, what is this? Okay, no, sorry, keep going. Yeah,
it's okay. You see them in a more wide open spaces at Pompeii. Okay. What they are is all right. So you probably saw the bodies when you went to Pompeii, right?
Yeah, not enough. We spent too much time walking around, but I did. I saw,
some.
A number of them. Yeah.
So what happens with that is when the volcanic material rains down, organic life forms like people got trapped in this lapilli, is what they're called there. And eventually the bodies decayed away and left a void. And early excavators saw these voids that were people, and they poured in plaster, and that's what those bodies are that you see on display. Those spider leg things with a platform, that's actually the same thing, but for a tree trunk and roots.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, they're all over Pompeii. None of them have signs. You have to know what you're looking for to see them. But they're all over, right by the amphitheater and
Oh, I wish I talked to you 2 months ago. I was there for the first time in January.
But what this lets us do at Pompeii, because especially these days, experts are really, they're keen to identify this kind of stuff. And like Barbara Burrell's doing excavations at a villa nearby. I think, is that a Plantis? I'm blanking on which villa it is, and different teams, they're able to see these, and they're able to now pour in the plaster and a different kind of plaster, which gets you more specific root casts. It was Wilhelmina Jastrzemski, by the way. She was the first one to develop this technique in the 70s. But now we're down to like this micro level of roots, which lets biologists then identify very closely to species, and much smaller plants as well, which means we can say, this tree was here, that tree was there, that stake in the ground that had a vine on it was right there.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And then from other types of things like archaeobotanical stuff and pollen samples, we can really put together a farmstead right in real place, what's growing where at the time of the eruption. And what we see is it looks nothing like our farms today. Nothing at all. When you go to like the Midwest, or in the Midwest, it's corn as far as you can see. And I don't know, in France, it's corn or sunflowers as far as you can see. In Greece, it's olive trees as far as you can see, And so we have this monoculture. This is the epitome of polyculture. It's one row of olives next to another row of a different kind of fruit tree. In between them is a row of vines. Right over there is a small little field for wheat and legumes. It's all in one farmstead. And that is extremely productive. If the more different, there's a lot of studies done by big agriculture as well, even funded by that show that the more biodiversity there is in a plot of land, the more you can produce. The amount that we think of ancient people getting out of a plot of land has been kind of, scholars until recently have underestimated it. In fact, ancient agriculture, probably a lot of it produced more per unit of land than modern industrial agriculture because it was so biodiverse. We don't like it for our economy today because it takes a lot more work, right? So it's an efficiency of labor issue. But in terms of maximizing your production out of the landscape in the face of something like climate change, we need to be thinking about polyculture systems. And, that's what most indigenous agriculture around the world is. That's what most ancient Greek and Roman agriculture around the world is. So on and so forth. That's actually how to be more productive and efficient and stable and resilient, sustainable and resilient with your sort of food production systems. And so we should be looking to these food production systems in the past to get some ideas on how to rejigger our own in the face of this. Would be one of my arguments.
Well, I imagine that looking back to what indigenous people did, in so many places, I think of North America so specifically, but, like they knew how to use the land without harming the land in a lot of ways. Like they really, really had this like actual real connection with the land and were able to do all of these things that we just, capitalism has just made it so that like it just doesn't occur in the same ways, and it's all about power and power structures versus particularly those indigenous groups that were less concerned with that and more concerned with just living happily on the land and honoring it and all of that. It's a really interesting thing, and I think particularly in North America, like I know that indigenous archaeology and stuff is studied, but obviously the colonial impacts that are still so long lasting mean that they're not, we're not looking as much as I think that we should. But it is so interesting to look at, the way that a lot of indigenous people really cared for their land in ways that is so different from us today. Like just a much more like holistic approach to
and it's much smarter. I mean, like think about it evolutionarily, like how long did people survive in the land doing these kind of traditional agricultural ways of life? They supported many thousands of years of generations of people. Industrialization, it looks like we're about to go out like a flash in a pan, where it's like if you think about it, like what we think of as smart, no, that way of life is the smart way. That's evolutionarily beneficial, is to actually honor the land around you and to understand how to live off of it in a sustainable way, not to just exploit it and accumulate wealth for no reason, other than a pissing contest.
Yeah. I mean, I could go on forever. But yeah, I love that that you made these connections, because I think, the connection to the modern day is so important. And just generally interesting to look at this comparison, because I think it's sometimes hard or easy to forget how many thousands of years ancient indigenous peoples lived on their lands without damaging a damn thing about it. And then, in the last few hundred years, we've just come in and torn it all up, and we're about to just like leave this planet in the dust because we don't know how to actually work with the land in the ways that are sustainable and lasting and actually benefit both the earth and the people.
That make it work together, and it's amazing because we live in a period where we have all this knowledge, and it's just like we have the ability to like it's not like the people in the early Iron Age had the ability to really track precipitation in the same way. And so
they figured it out.
They figured it out. I mean, it took a while, but we know how to figure it out right now. We have the understanding of why indigenous agriculture was ecological, for example, and sustainable. We have the ability to understand that the climate is changing and that it's not about to stop. So we need to do something about it. And so it's just so silly to think about, I don't know, like as if should be some debate between science and humanities or something like that, or scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is scientific, and scientific knowledge helps us understand how to tackle these problems, and so we should be taking that and using figuring out how to survive and thrive.
Well, I mean, the big difference is we know we need to do this. We know we need to adapt. Whereas, in the early Iron Age, they're looking at it. They're like, they're not certain yet. Like it probably took a while for them to realize they had to adapt, because you don't notice things are changing until they've been changing for a while.
Exactly.
Because it feels like a blip until you're like, well, actually, I guess it's been 10 years of this. Now we have to look at starting to adapt. And then you have more of like that transition, that figuring it out.
And even then, what is this called? The baseline effect? Yeah, the shifting baseline effect is another big thing which prevents us from realizing this. Where, you don't always realize that things have changed because your own ground zero is shifting alongside it, right?
Right.
And so this is a well-known human phenomenon. It's why it's really difficult to detect something like climate change, because it happens so gradually that even by the time it's changed to the point where things should be observable, your memory has sort of changed about what things were like. And, we're only so clever unless we measure things. And
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm utterly thrilled with the turn that this took to modern climate change. I mean, I suppose I saw it coming too, but I'm thrilled with.
I told you I was going to talk about climate change.
I mean, yeah, and even if you hadn't been going to talk about it in the modern world, I certainly would have brought it up.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, this is absolutely fascinating.
Good.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this.
Of course.
I've kept you for a while. So
No, it's okay. I don't have to do what I was doing, so it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Perfect. This has been an incredible episode. Do you want to tell my listeners where they can read more from you, hear more from you, whatever you want to share?
Yeah, so my name is Flint Dibble, and you can find me on most of what I'm going to try to produce for the public will be on YouTube. But if I write or do other things, you can find me on other social media like X or Blue Sky or Threads or whatever, Mastodon. Yeah, under my name, Flint Dibble.
That one still exists too.
Yeah, I mean, I mostly just go on there to post stuff, but I don't know. I used to really like writing Twitter threads. I really like the medium. It let me express myself about archaeology in a nice way, and this takeover of it by Elon Musk just really, I don't know.
It changed it all. I really miss the old Twitter too.
Yeah, I mean, I'm debating just trying to ignore that and just try to recreate what I was doing, and it's sort of like the idea of going on Joe Rogan. You have to appeal to where people are, and if we have as scholars, I think we have to stop just talking to ourselves, but talk to the public at large about what we know and why it matters. And it's not easy, but something like Twitter, X, whatever the hell you want to call it, I still call it Twitter most of the time. It's sort of like, look, that's still a very effective platform for sharing this kind of stuff because it is. And so I don't like that he's taking it over, but what can I do? It's just, I have to live my life. We all have to live our lives in this shitty situation where the oligarchs own everything and don't think about anything other than their own wealth. And so just sucks.
Well, they'll bring themselves down with us if they
will. That's actually an article I really want to write, is like how they need to recognize that there's no escaping this. If you look back to history, they're totally fucked, all of them. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whatever, doesn't matter who they are, they're all fucked. Just like we all are.
Bezos is gonna burn alongside us. It's fine.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Oh, geez. And your YouTube, is that just
YouTube? It's Archaeology with Flint Dibble is what it's called. But yeah,
wonderful.
It's my name. And find me. I have some fun stuff coming out. A big video about Atlantis, and another one called Disproving Lost Civilizations.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I'll link to everything in the episode's description too, so everyone can find it.
Cool.
But yeah, that sounds wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing this. It's been very fun.
Good.
Nerds, thank you so much for listening. Oh my gosh, it was such a fun episode. And as you heard at the end, you can find more from Flint about all of this very real and fascinating archaeology on YouTube. I've linked to that in the episode's description. As well, since we recorded this, though I was told off mic before we recorded, but since we recorded this, Flint has gone on a podcast. I think the intention is good. I'm having trouble saying it because it is the Joe Rogan podcast and I have thoughts and feelings. But it was to debate Graham Hancock, who talks a lot about pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history and things like that. And so if you enjoyed my Atlantis episodes or, the time I returned to this type of stuff when that quote-unquote documentary Ancient Apocalypse came out, if you're interested in that, you might want to check out this episode. Just look for Flint's name in your podcast app. I feel like that's better. And next week, on Tuesday, instead of a standard narrative episode, I will be bringing you the last episode of this Bronze Age series, another conversation, and one with, I think he's probably considered to be the top name in the Bronze Age collapse. And if he's not the top one, then he's certainly among them. I'll be speaking with Dr. Eric Klein, who's the author of 1177 BCE, the year civilization collapsed, about, exactly that. And so much more. So stay tuned. That's coming on Tuesday. Thank you all so much for listening. Let's Talk About Myths Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert, but of course this series would not exist without the brain of Michaela Smith, the assistant producer. And of course Laura Smith is the audio engineer and production assistant working on the audio of all of these conversations. The podcast is part of the iHeartMedia network. Questioning myself, this thing I say all of the time. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. Help me continue bringing you the world of ancient Greece and the Mediterranean by subscribing to my Patreon, where you will get access to loads of past bonus episodes from the almost 7 years that I've been doing this thing. Holy crap, it's been a while. Thank you all so much for listening. These dives into history, I have a love with like a little bit of hate relationship with them. They just require such different brain space for me. And oh my gosh. But speaking to these experts, that is the best part, because I just get to sit back and like be in utter awe of some of the stuff. And it's just incredible. I hope you learned a lot. I sure did. I am Liv and I love this shit.